So I'm just going to make a few very quick comments, and I have some combination of questions and comments for our panelists, but rather than sort of forcing them to respond to me, we'll just sort of open it up for our conversation. In fact, what I'll do is I'll invite our panelists. Why don't you just pull up some chairs right here so we can all face the audience, or if you want to gather on the couch, I don't know, probably easier just to bring some chairs right here. So first, quickly, I want to thank and congratulate the conference organizers again, Niall Fort and Heath Pearson, for envisioning and organizing this gathering. I remember when they came to me and to Eddie Glaude a little over a year ago, this idea for a graduate conference, and we were both, of course, immediately supportive. But I in particular sort of gave them one specific charge. I told them to be bold and to be innovative, right? There are, as we all know, scores upon scores of academic conferences every year, right? And I want them to do something different. That to me is our challenge in Black Studies, our challenge specifically here in the Department of African American Studies at Princeton, to do something, to use our resources to convene different sorts of conversations. And I think, without a doubt, they rose to that challenge. And of course, they did so with the help of our amazing staff. I want to thank our panelists for their thought-provoking contributions. I learned a lot from all of these papers. And I think while they cover somewhat disparate topics and take really distinctive approaches, there is, I think, some productive interplay, really productive interplay to be found between them. So we're assembled this afternoon under the broad and broadly inclusive canopy of place. So it seems to me that one of the things that we've come together to do then is to think about the production of place and of place making in relationship to mourning, in relationship to protests, but also to imagined futures, to dream for liberation and what Aimee Cox refers to as fugitive joy, or as Drake would have it, more life. I think one of the threads that for me runs through these papers is the theme of memory, the way that rememberings and memorialization, forgetting and silences inform the way particular places come to be understood as significant or not in Black life and in Black lives. We have, for example, on the one hand, Tuskegee, the historic Black institutional pillar of the Deep South that appears and reappears throughout 19th and 20th century African American life and letters, a place that has become defined by and indeed synonymous with its founder and patriarch, Booker T. Washington. But as Brian Jones helpfully excavates, there are other traditions, other veins to be mined, alternative histories of protest and even radicalism. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have, for example, New York's Hart Island, right? Potter's Field, mass burial ground for the condemned, the forgotten, the ignored, the unclaimed. An island just off the proverbial coast, but as distant from the city's vector of power as perhaps can be. So I want to just, these are so again, themes and questions that jumped out at me from each of the papers, and I'll just kind of throw them at you if you'll indulge me. So for Brian, one question I have is sort of what is the significance of Young's veteran status, right? To the extent that people know of Sammy Young and his death and the way that SNCC mobilizes it, his status as not only a Tuskegee student but as a veteran, it seems signally important. You sort of touch on it a little bit. I wonder maybe if that's part of the conversation we might have about that particular action and sort of how that specifically informs the students' subsequent activism. I mean, I'm really intrigued about the way they challenge the ROTC presence and what you call the kind of military tradition of Tuskegee. So that's one. I wondered about the white establishment of Macon County. What is their nature? I mean, we know in these histories of civil rights, the kind of specificity of the kind of white political and economic elite in any one place can really have a great influence on how activists took their course and how things unfolded in any particular place. I wonder about the white establishment, both in the county but also within the institutional hierarchy of Tuskegee, right? I mean, presumably there are white trustees. I think you showed us a photo at least of one. So how do they operate in this store and how do they react to the student activism? Finally, I had a question about Gwen Patton and about gender more broadly. She's this really important figure. You bring that to us, and I'm sure in the dissertation you bring that out. And I just kind of wonder what were the sort of gender norms, in addition to the norms of kind of middle class respectability and race, that shapes activism, student activism in Tuskegee in this particular place. LaShaya. I want us collectively to think about how we theorize witness in this context. I mean, I really love the way you're troubling this relationship between affect and evidence and the kind of ethics of display. But I wondered about about witness in sort of in the Black tradition in particular, and how the case of the African burial ground makes us rethink that or sit with that in a different way. In listening to your paper, reading your paper, listening to your paper, and this came up in several of the other presentations as well, I want us to think also about time. Right, we're here to talk about place, but I think we can't actually think about place separate from time in a way. How does Black mourning and memory work challenge, disrupt, circumvent dominant conceptions of time, of progress, right? Especially those kinds of dominant conceptions are moored in place, right? Particular places. Right, so the African burial ground, is in the site that's being developed by the city at different moments, right, and particularly at that moment of its sort of rediscovery, re-excavation, right. So there's a certain sense of the city has to progress, and then there are these Black activists and kind of a larger Black community that's pushing back against that. But I think a lot of that has to do, or something there about time. I wondered about the work that bodies do. That bodies must do, that you show us, the deceased body, but sort of more broadly, the work that bodies must do. What is the relationship between place and work? The place of burial in this case is almost necessarily distinct from the site of labor, although sort of maybe in a broader sense, this is near where this community once existed and where people labor, but it's not in the specific site of where they labor. So how do we sort of think about place and labor and bodies for Black life? Ingrid, I love your phrase, the Archipelago of Sadness. As I was listening and reading your paper, I thought about the kind of similar formulation to our archipelago of the condemned, of the dispossessed, and the dead. But this Archipelago of Sadness is really a beautiful and really haunting kind of phrase. I wonder what it meant for the dead to be inaccessible to the public, which of course is sort of central to your paper. But this again for all of us. What about the accessibility of place? What does it mean for, like, Tuskegee is a place that we can go to, or the African burial ground as it exists today is a place that we can go to. But Hart Island is at a certain remove. It's sort of defined in some ways by its remoteness. So what do we do with that? As you were describing the scene, I thought a bit about, I was struck by the sonic qualities, and I wondered if that might come up in other presentations as well, other of our panelists' work. What are the sonic qualities, the soundings of Black and poor decline, decimation, and death, and ultimately mourning? What does it sound like? What does Black mourning sound like across time and in isolation? Finally, I want to know about the indigenous history of Hart Island. Right, it seems to me that there was a kind of prehistory there that perhaps you just didn't have time for in this presentation, but we might think about as well as a history that predates any kind of colonial settlements and where that figures in the history of mourning and collective grief. And that the way you very beautifully ended by connecting Hart Island as a marker of both the New York City's past and its future, right? The past and its future. The past, central to that past, of course, is an indigenous past, which is always already written out. And then finally, Aimee, really beautiful work that drew a lot of different threads together, so I don't want to rehash. But one of the things, of course, is a kind of central theme in Black letters, of course, roots and routes. The sort of centrality of movement to placemaking. So both physical movement, but as you show us really lovely in a lovely way, the kind of flight that's enabled by the imagination. So how can we think more about that? I wondered about what was generationally specific in the kind of fugitive practices of Black women and Black girls, and what is sort of transcendent, right? There's a sense, and that's the kind of historian in me, perhaps, but that's why we have these cross-disciplinary conversations, right? But I wonder what was kind of generationally specific, what is of a particular time and place, and what is kind of more universal in kind of the practices of kind of fugitivity and joy and so forth. Sort of embedded in that, what knowledge gets passed down? You kind of hinted at that towards the end of your talk. What knowledge gets passed down from one generation to the next? And finally, what I also take away from your work, the way that places, maybe it's a question really, sort of how can places of trauma and precarity also be sites of joy? Or at least spaces of imagination, spaces of dreaming, spaces of breath. All right. So with that, I will, unless anyone has any of the panelists have a kind of burning response to anything I said that you want to just sort of put on the table or to elaborate on. Otherwise, we have about 20 minutes or so for our conversation. And I will just raise your hand or your finger or do whatever. And if you could introduce yourself when you ask your question or give your comments.
Oh, you want us to start anywhere?
Well, you all can start anywhere. I don't know if the audience has been sitting here so patiently, had things that they wanted to jump in, but if not, we'll talk amongst ourselves. Yes.
Hi, LaRonda Grace. I am a teacher at Berkshire School up in Sheffield, Massachusetts. Just wanted to say to Dr. Cox, born and raised in Detroit, migrant. That story is so poignant for me personally. How I ended up in Massachusetts from Detroit, and now as I wind down my career, hearing that story makes me want to go back home. So thank you for that.
Thank you. I mean, I guess
Yeah, please.
so I was taking notes as each of you were speaking, and I was thinking about, someone asked me this before the panel, why you don't talk about death. And when I was thinking about in each of your presentations that were, on the surface about death, how much life was still, the possibility of life within those conversations, and what does it mean to think about our panel's place? What does it mean to think about not place? When we think about death and place together, it ultimately brings up the idea of a stagnant place, right? An immobile place, a fixed place. But I guess I'm not trying to moderate.
No.
But I guess part of the what I saw across your papers was this beautiful way that we think about place, and the way that Josh is asking us to think about it as mobile. And I don't mean just in your imagination, like you can be wherever you want to be. But I mean like what is the practice of placemaking? What does that really mean as a strategy, and what does that mean as a way to challenge slow death or social death? I don't know, and it doesn't. You don't have to answer that, but I was struck by that. I kept thinking about life in each of your talks, and that's so powerful in the ways that you talk about bodies as more than the corpse, right? And the connection between the live body and the dead body.
In the back.
There's a movie coming out soon about the Detroit riots of 1967. I was wondering if any of you women from Detroit have any interest in seeing that film.
Yeah, I think so. It's going to be a great movie, for sure. Yeah.
Thank you for a great panel. This is very thought-provoking. Part of the response and Dr. Cox, some of your words just now kind of make me think about how place as a subject kind of acts in all of your papers. So I'm also thinking about Christina Sharp's earlier work and kind of showing the mason jars full of the dirt, and what would that mean to kind of put the physical place as a literal subject in conversation with some of your work. I'm thinking about like the African burial grounds, for example, and also Hart Island. There's something there that I think maybe diving into that in the indigenous roots of that might help me at least kind of think through that possibility. But I had a specific question for you, Dr. Cox, because there was something that you had mentioned about struggling. Well, first of all, I think that's a wonderful word.
We should all incorporate that into our.
I definitely, I was getting that, especially when you mentioned the gendered aspects of it. It kind of made me, it gave me like a Black feminist critique of Cool Optimism by Lauren Berlant, right? So kind of like this, the inaccessibility of, or like the impossibility of kind of attaining what generations of women have been struggling for. And I was just wondering if, what are the, could you just flesh out, what are the intergenerational connection? What's the intergenerationality of struggliness? Really, like what about being able to like look at Bessie and be like, oh yeah, like, you know, have that relationship to the women in your family, but like at the same time not critique the like patriarchal like the invisibilization of like patriarchy there. Yeah, I just think about like the gendered aspect of it. I'm also getting like Corregidora vibes from like your narrative. I'm getting like Paradise vibes by Toni Morrison from it too. But mostly I'm interested in how like intergenerationality functions for struggling.
Yeah, I think thank you for all of that. And I think it's a really important question. And I think specifically for the young women in the Brown family, that third generation that ends up in the homeless shelter, in many ways, that's shameful for their grandmother and their mothers. In fact, they're seen as having gone backwards. Like, we were never in a homeless shelter. But there's a way that the young women in the third generation are able to take the idea of what, for example, home means, what love means, what care means, both within their family and by the state, and say that you can create these institutions, right? For example, the institution of the family. Just because we actually have an actual roof over our head doesn't mean that this is a home space. So in many ways, I think what has been passed down to them is a way of wanting to be successful. So Bessie came from Alabama. She wanted to get married. She wanted to have the clerical job. She wanted to have like this normative, very heteronormative lifestyle that was inaccessible to her for a variety of reasons. What's passed down is the witnessing, if we're talking about witnessing, the witnessing of what did and didn't happen in Bessie's life by that third generation, and naming it, right? And I'm so glad you brought up, not naming it as the fault of Bessie or the fault of Gwen and Ruby, but really looking at being able to name those systems. Like, just because we live in a house doesn't mean that it's a safe house, doesn't mean it's well taken care of. Just because you have a job doesn't mean we're actually still able to eat. I'm going to go to this homeless shelter, which has the charge of taking care of folks who are homeless. I'm naming myself as homeless. So in many ways, I think one of the most powerful things that was passed down to those young women was the ability to reclaim almost language. If we think about the co-opting, like, for example, of civil rights language by conservatives, they almost did the flip of that. Like, call me high risk and homeless, and I will get what I deserve because you have created the circumstances by which I am high risk and homeless. And so I think it's fascinating to watch how these young women they're looking at and they respect and love their mothers and their aunties. Like, I see why you're struggling, but struggling is, I work hard, I'm not afraid to work hard, but there's gotta be something on the other side of that. The struggly is doing all of that stuff, and there's nothing on the other side of that. It's the same, it's like Groundhog Day, the same thing over and over again. But I thank you for that question, because it does, all parts of that question. I think it's important to think more specifically about the gendered aspects, and also your question, Josh, what is this like what's passed down, right? What is universal, like what happens between mothers and daughters? What is specific to sort of a Black narrative? You know what I mean? So I think these are, I didn't answer it, I just rephrased it. But I just want to have room for other folks to talk. Thank you for that.
Thank you all for your talks. LaShaya, I had a specific question for you and how you're complicating the unavoidable objectivity of mourning or commemoration, and how a lot of the times it always has to be spectacular, in that, Martin Luther King is the exception, Frederick Douglass is the exception, and we have monuments to these people. And so whether it be a positive commemoration or a mourning memorial, does it always have to be this exceptional instance or perceived as a disruption from something that is institutional or systemic? And if it is or if it isn't, how can we commemorate outside of images, like you were asking? Is it in a place like #say her name, so we can know, but we don't have to associate the image and disseminate those images of violence?
Yeah, and I will admit that I am, part of my ambivalence is also my working through it, and this is how this work started. And I have, in my previous life, I was a museum educator, so I saw the power of objects and images and how it really did mediate this history, these experiences for people. But then I often asked, what's at risk, as I did in the paper. So a lot of the inspiration for the paper also comes from my frustrations with precisely what you're saying, like this watered down this watered down presentation of Black history that we see particularly in, say, museums or elementary school textbooks. And I think that it doesn't, I think the content and also the form that it's presented in is so constrained. And I think that part of the work that I would love to do in museums is to think about how to, and I use the word edutainment because you are going for an experience, but you're also often going to learn. So how to do that in a more nuanced way, how to do it in a way that conveys, the information, but also in an ethical way. And this paper also, part of the framework for the thesis was about memorial museums and how, if we think about like the Black experience, there isn't a memorial museum. And Christina Sharp actually talks about that in The Wake. And so one of the things that I think that we could do is think about how structurally narratives work. So for example, at the 9/11 Museum, if there are going to be graphic images or images that people might find disturbing, the exhibition is designed in a way that you know that ahead of time and you can choose whether to go around this corner or not, and bypass it if you don't want to. But there's like this, and it has a lot to do with like the recency of 9/11 and all of that. But I think that, it's a certain ethics of representation that I'm interested in. And also robustly telling Black histories. Like it doesn't have to be only, these charismatic leaders and the idea of movements and, this art from slavery to Obama. Literally, I just went to a museum, and when I gone there one time, like it ended some way, I don't know, but then there was an installation about Obama the next time I went. So that is the narrative arc.
Ryan wanted to jump in.
I just want to say something. To me, a thread here, and maybe part of the hope, is that there's a dialectic to the way that these places play out, where the powerful and dominant might have some design or plan for the place that the people who are there and subject to it can end up flipping the script. I mean, that's the story of Detroit as a place, back and forth. Detroit was the power of auto, and like white supremacist, capitalist business owners, and then Black people went there, and then it became Motown, and like a center of Black culture and power. That was not the plan for Detroit. It was for it to be that, but people made it that. And then they came in with a hammer and tried to destroy that and clear that out. So now that the process is like starting all over again. But there's and then the women in the homeless shelter who try to take hold of something and say, you've designed it for us to circulate in this thing. Actually, we're going to try to take the resources and do something different with it. That's what I see in Tuskegee. That Tuskegee is a place that was funded, along with Hampton, more than any other HBCU for half a century. Had huge endowments compared to other HBCUs for a purpose of upholding, arguably, white supremacy that then becomes center of black power and radical ideas. I mean, they flip it. It has a long-standing collaboration with colonialism and imperialism in the U.S. military, going all the way back. And then they flip it. And it becomes a center of anti-war agitation. So there's a way in which that's not guaranteed, but that's a possibility that's out there, is that dominant plans will get reversed by the people who are participating in them. And that's what I see. That to me is like the hope in all of this, is that there's contradictions in what they set up that open up space for us to do something different. Not only imagine different things, but actually do different things. Can I just respond to your questions real quick?
Absolutely. Go for it.
I want to think more about the way that the veteran status plays out. I do think it's a powerful part of it. Like there's a community of people who still remember him, and they often portray him in that uniform. That photo of him, and even Foreman's book has him in the uniform on the cover. And so that's very powerful to say. Not only is he like a civil rights student activist, but he's like somebody who participated. It gives him a certain moral standing. Like you fought in the military, and this is what you come home and die. Like so, there's
a long history of that.
A long history of that, and they're certainly playing into that. Even though it was a relatively short stint, in the Navy, but still he was there. The whites in Tuskegee are fascinating. In short, white liberals take over and push out the old like plantocracy, segregationist crackers who are like increasingly pushed out. And it's a story of what's happening in the South. as the South is modernizing and industrializing. There's a new class of like white business people who are like, okay, they can shop here, like who cares? They're willing to throw off some of the anachronisms of Jim Crow as long as they keep their power and their wealth and other things in place. So there's a kind of neo-colonialism that emerges, whatever. But Manning Marable and others have written about that. But what's fascinating is they take over the Tuskegee News, the local newspaper, and they are like, really like, we've got to hire black people at the bank. Like, that's got to happen. And they're like hard about that. But then they're equally hard on Stokely Carmichael. And they're like, this guy is a problem. And they want to run him out of town. And it's editorial after editorial against SNCC, against Stokely Carmichael. They come out and they chastise Martin Luther King in 1965 for speaking out against the Vietnam War in the pages of in the editorial of Tuskegee News. Like, so they are a certain kind of white liberals who have a certain politics that's pro, gradualism and integration to a certain extent, and against black radicalism and blah, blah, blah. The gender thing is very complex, and I want to think more about it and try to explore it more and write about it. I certainly asked everybody about it, and the answers are various. My sense from the newspaper and the interviews and the research is that black women had a wider field in Tuskegee than probably in other aspects of Southern life. Like, Tuskegee was a place where they could write for the newspaper, they could be in charge of the newspaper. They could do things that they couldn't do in other places. But of course there's a very gendered, the middle class respectability stuff is like, we're trying to claim a certain kind of womanhood that is very normative. So in the student newspaper, even as the radicalism builds, there's still the beauty queen and the beauty this and beauty tips. And even when it goes black power, it's like, okay, but now the beauty tips are about how to maintain your afro, how to maintain your natural hair, but it's still beauty, you know what I mean? So there's still and it's always women in the beauty category, it's never men. So there's still a lot of that stuff that's going on. Gwen Patton is in that way exceptional, and she's doing things that other women aren't doing, and she's also, I think, showing that there's more room to do that. One funny story, and I'll just end with this, is that a Tuskegee student I interviewed who came to Tuskegee from New York, told me she got to her dorm, the segregated, gender segregated dorm, and all of the girls in her dorm, in their powder kits and purses, had guns. And she was the only one who did not. And it was like, why are you all have weapons? And it was like, you just don't send your Southern, because most Tuskegee students came from the South, you don't send your Southern daughter traveling around without a weapon. And so the New Yorker was the unarmed one, but all the black women from the South had dorms in their purses and no big deal. I thought that was a fascinating commentary on womanhood and what's normal.
Ingrid, I want to make sure you have a chance if you want to jump in on anything.
Yeah, so I'll try to synthesize a few of the things. I mean, I guess, sort of the question of can the inaccessibility of Hart Island hold? One of my feelings is that with the Department of Correction sort of reluctantly having its arm twisted by this New York Civil Liberties Union lawsuit to open up to regular visits, the current demand, of having 50 to 70 people visit once a month, each month, I don't think the Department of Correction is equipped to continue to facilitate that, in terms of not having, people who are trained to run the visits, not having visitor facilities like restrooms. So I think it's an interesting sort of tipping point in terms of how will things go. Will it end up closing down more if it opens up? Will it be commodified in the way things so often are in New York? Or is there an opportunity to flip the script? And because this land, has been preserved, for all these dead, to actually make it a place that's open and for remembrance. In terms of the Indigenous history, Hart Island, like most islands in the Bronx itself was owned by the Lenape Indians, and the Dutch bought it in the 17th century. As far as I know, it wasn't ever inhabited because it's very much like sort of this barrier island, most exposed to the wind coming off of the tidal inlet and storms and whatnot. But I also wouldn't be surprised if there's some prehistory that's fallen out of the records. But so the fact that Hart Island is a potter's field also means that it's paradoxically the place where you get closest to seeing the Bronx in its natural state. It's overgrown. It's very much sort of land that hasn't been touched except for the small area where there are some buildings. Can can we flip the script? Can we open it up and sort of like protect the dead and what they've meant? I mean, like with the 9/11 museum, like as many people as died in 9/11 are buried on Hart Island every year. If we gave like an ounce of the energy we've given to memorializing and clearing space for and thinking about the dead of 9/11 to, you know, the city's most marginalized dead, you know, who continue to be buried in this like very hidden way. I think it could be very different, and that would ideally be the direction that things go in.
We have time for maybe one final question or comment, and then any final words from our panelists. Yes.
Hello, thank you for presenting. And my comment or question just is, in hearing, especially like the bones and being resurrected in a way and looked at right, and it being the Easter tide, like we've just come out of this, and a few weeks ago the scriptural text that many preachers were preaching on is the valley of dry bones and breathing life into them. And so I'm curious if, because you had, right, this need to look at the bones and to learn from them, for them to tell stories, as well as this cry to like let the dead like be dead and honor them in this space, or remove them from this space, which already was very violent to them. Like let's not continue to perpetuate violence. I'm curious if your take would be that in learning from the bones in this way is an example of like breathing life into them. So you're bringing up these very dead bones to life, or if it's the opposite, and to breathe life would allow them to either stay where they are or to be moved to somewhere else, and just sort of in this timely time to have the conversation. That's what I was struck by, and even your comment of this almost idea of witness, right? And witness is very right in there with religion and Christianity, and like, what are these bones witnessing to the truth? Do they witness in their silence? Do they witness in what they tell us from us perpetuating some form of violence again upon them to learn? But yeah, so I'm just curious, perhaps thoughts on this.
Yeah, I would say from my research, and primarily through the institutional archives at the African Burial Ground, so like looking at some of the articles that the archaeologists and anthropologists who worked on the project published, but also some meeting correspondence, the newsletter that circulated during the time that was updating people about the progress of their research. I would say that that was the intent of the researchers who designed the proposal and were hired and ultimately carried it out. And again, like I would say that most people did desire to know and desired, again, to have the bones be the most telling or the most convincing evidence of that. And I would say that was probably most people. But I think it's also interesting for me how people, I took a methodology course, and the teacher said, you know, the things that everybody agrees on isn't like, you know, where you want to delve really deep, is where everyone agrees on all these other things except for this particular thing. And not to highlight contention or, you know, to show how things were, people had disparate interpretations of what should happen, but to really think about how these things, ultimately people have the same goal. Like they all did really want to honor the dead, and some thought that was, you know, to leave them. There was a woman who's been a volunteer probably for 20 years, and she was speaking more in terms of the monument, and she said like she at first didn't think that it should be this huge monument. She thought that it should be a grassy area that people could come and pray and affirm and meditate. And then she said afterwards, when she saw the monument, she then appreciated the draw of the monument. And so I think that one of the powerful things to think, and I'm always thinking about like how history is mobilized and how it's made real for people. I think that there are different ways of doing that, and even different ways of like experiencing the space when we're thinking about, what is particular about space. And I think for the burial grounds and for cemeteries, I think it is often that continuity that is the draw.
Thank you. So in reading the papers and having this conversation, I was thinking a lot about the late Haitian anthropologist Michel Rolfe-Trio, his book Silencing the Past, which I recommend to all who have not yet read it. And talks, one of the things he talks about in sort of great length is the question of power. And I think all these papers make us think about the power, how power shapes narratives. Trio writes, "Power does not enter the story once and for all, but at different times and at different angles. It precedes the narrative proper, contributes to its creation and its interpretation. In history, power begins at the source." I think for me, all of these papers are entering into that power dynamic, right? All four of you, I think, scholars are re-narrating histories and experiences of Black life and Black death in really important ways. I'm inspired by the work. I'm inspired by the conversation. I thank all of you, and I thank you all for joining us. So.